Hello and welcome to Catamount Community Connection, our weekly public affairs program here at Catamount Radio. Nice to have you with us today. I'm Brian Collamore, the host of the program, and each week, as you well know by now, we talk with community leaders from the business, professional, nonprofit, and political arenas. And the goal is to make you all informed of things that are going on in Rutland County, but also throughout the state. And today we will be talking about a lot of legislation that passed in the recently concluded legislative session, a new law or regulation that will be going into effect very quickly, or in some cases already has. And our show is brought to you by the Rutland County Agricultural Society, which has brought you the Vermont State Fair at Rutland since 1846. And we are looking forward to the 178th fair coming up August 12th through the 16th this year at the fairgrounds. We had Robert Congdon on for the last 2 weeks, so we had quite an opportunity to talk to him about things that were of concern to the agricultural community. Then we talked about the 3-acre rule, and we also talked about some of the acts that will be coming to the Vermont State Fair this year. So hopefully everybody's planning on attending again August 12th through the 16th at the Vermont State Fairgrounds. So today we are very happy to welcome back into the show State Senator Terry Williams, who lives in Poultney but represents 27 towns in Rutland County. And we're going to talk a little bit, and please don't misunderstand that we could possibly even in an hour get through all of what happened in the recently concluded session, but we'll talk about some of the main things that the legislature did and how it may impact you. And Terry, welcome back. It's always great to have you on.
Good morning, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we will talk a little bit about both. I have a list from the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, some of the bills that were of interest and importance to them. And I know you have some as well from the education side. And of course, that wound up being the bill that, I don't want to say delayed us, but in fact it did delay us until May 30th. That was the day that finally it became obvious that we weren't going to be able to pass anything in terms of the education reform. So we did come back on, now I'm remembering, was it June 18th, I think? 16th.
Yep.
And that was the veto session, so-called, even though we never took up any vetoes. But we did concentrate that day on both the elections bill and then eventually also the veterans military exemption. We're certainly going to talk about that. And then the education bill, and it was passed out. So I don't know where we want to start, but normally in the legislative session, the final bill is the so-called big bill, the budget. But this year that was not the case. That was signed back into law, I believe, in early June. The governor signed it into law, and so we have a $9.1 billion budget for fiscal year 26, and the transportation bill and the capital bill were also already passed and signed into law by the governor. So it was the education bill, which was H474, I believe. Yep. Yeah. So that was the one that, I don't want to say hung us up, but that's pretty much what it did. And we did finally pass that out. And now we will be looking for, I believe it's a 13-member task force that will be meeting throughout the summer. I think they convene on July 1st. So this coming week, they'll have their first meeting. And there'll be representatives from both the Senate, the House of Representatives, and then gubernatorial appointees and other folks from the educational system. And they will come up with, hopefully, because if they don't, the whole thing goes to bed. It doesn't. The law refuses to go into effect. They'll come up with the maps, the so-called district maps, and so that will be something that we'll be looking forward to as they meet over the summer. And maybe I'll just let Terry kind of walk through some of the things that he was involved with, some of the things that he felt were important that we did this year, and we'll kind of go back and forth here for the next 55 minutes or so.
So on the education bill, and I was wrong, it was H454 that finally passed out. We took it up in both the House and the Senate education committees, and the the House Committee on Education went right to work putting together a bill. I think Casey Toof is he's the minority leader the assistant minority leader for the Republican caucus. Really sponsored that bill and pushed it forward. And the Senate Education Committee, basically what we did was we kept getting the governor's plan read to us so that we fully understood his concept, and Zoe Saunders presented that to Secretary of Education. And we took testimony about, how it was going to affect small schools and rural schools. And basically, about halfway through the session, I said to the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, are we going to actually take up a bill, or are we just going to accept what the House gives us? And his reply was, no, we're going to take up our own bill. And, we never did. Basically, what we did was we took the House Education Bill, H5 or 454, and we amended it so that the Senate committee was happy with it, passed out of our committee unanimously. And then we sent it back to the House, and it kind of morphed into had to go to Finance. Finance basically took back everything that was in the House version and added their financial issues, I can't remember what they call it now, the funding part of it, and then it got put back on the floor. It never came back to the Senate committee. So I guess long story short was that we couldn't come to an agreement between the two chambers, and it did go to a caucus committee of conference, which we were finally able to get out. And it was a long slog getting through that, but we finally did. So that was about it for the education. I'm looking forward to, I think by January, the task force on the district boundaries has to have a report back to both committees. And then we're going to vote on it. Hopefully it'll get done, and then we can proceed with the governor's plan.
Just for people to kind of get them caught up, in Vermont right now, as we speak, and we're recording this on the 27th of June, there are 52 supervisory unions in Vermont, under which there are 119 districts that serve some 83,000 students. The original proposal from the Scott administration would have reduced the number of school districts to 5, and then that was, I think, advanced knowing that it probably would not gain enough traction to pass. The foundation formula, so-called, under the administrative plan was $13,200 per student. And that is the amount of money that the state would pay per student without weights being attached to it to educate them. And there were other formulas that were suggested. I believe the final one was somewhere north of 15,000. And it will all disappear, as Terry mentioned, if the task force does not come up with maps that would be approved by the legislature. We have that, I don't know if it's a check back feature. Some people have labeled it that way. But if the legislature doesn't approve what they've come back with by January 1st, the entire bill, in essence, gets repealed, and we unfortunately would have to start all over. So I think there were a number of people, and I'm going to speak for both the Democrats, the Republicans, and even the progressives, who felt strongly enough, because it did pass both chambers, that we needed to do something this year. It's not the perfect bill. I don't think anybody that voted yes for it felt that it was the all-encompassing bill, but it would at least put things on the table in order to continue to speak about, how we're going to reform it. So the foundation formula is not necessarily locked into place, but it could happen at that point. And there's, additional weights. Districts would be given credit for certain things that might happen in their own district. And so my committee, the Government Operations Committee, will then take that and come up with wards within the districts, and then within the ward, the school boards, and how we're going to put people in place there. There's a long way to go on this bill. And so people that were urging us to vote no on it, The problem with that was, at least as far as I'm concerned, and I'll just speak for myself on this, if we didn't do anything, if we did vote no and it went down, it wasn't, according to the Secretary of State, possible that we would be able to get anything done until like 29. So I felt very strongly that we needed to do something. And then the other thing that people kept saying was their property taxes were going to go up. And I think it's important to realize next year, fiscal year 26, it has nothing to do with the bill that was passed, the 454 bill. We managed to find $77 million in one-time money, and there was a surplus in the education fund of about $30 million. So together, I think it totaled about $111 million. We used that to buy down the property tax rate for next year. So on an average, most school districts will see an increase of about 1.1% in their property taxes. Some will be a little higher and some will be a little lower, quite frankly. But the bill that was passed in the late stages of this past session doesn't affect anything for next year. Next year is completely separate. It, in essence, follows the same trajectory that's in place right now. The year after, nobody has said anything about yet. And we're going to have to buy it down again, or we're going to face some substantial tax increases. And then finally, by fiscal year 29, which starts July of 28, this new bill will take effect, and we will gradually see a reduction in property tax rates. At least we hope so. That was the point of the whole thing. So that's just sort of a background picture of where we are right now. And many have argued that we have an administrative overload on top of the educational system, and that there are other places in the world. For instance, Hawaii, as I understand, has one school district, one for all of that state. New York City, I believe, only has one, and certainly a lot more students than we have here in Vermont. And the other piece of this is, as Terry well knows, because Terry and Senator Weeks from Rutland County both sit on the Education Committee in the Senate, the population of our schools continues to decline, and the Agency of Education had a prediction or a projection. It wasn't necessarily it was a projection based on numbers they actually have, that by 2030, we're going to go from the 83,000 students that we have now to about 77,000. So there's an additional 6,000 students that won't be in school in Vermont unless we have this huge influx of brand new families moving in with kids. And quite frankly, that's probably not going to happen. So that said, that's what the property taxes will look like next year. And again, we're going to have to come up with a plan for the year after, because this new bill won't take effect until the year after that. So much work still to be done on that.
So optimistically, going back to the student demographic, it continues to decline. And one of the things that we talked about extensively was how are we going to get in front of this decline? If you look at the bar graph, and we need to, number one, we need to set the governance, the district boundaries, anticipating we're going to lose additional students between now and when the plan is implemented in 2029. And we also have to anticipate that we might be able to turn this around before then, and we may start to get an influx of additional students and families into Vermont, which everybody hopes for. And then my biggest question was that to the Secretary of Education, hopefully you've planned into this school construction for, what happens in the event that we do get the additional population of students and we don't have enough classroom space for them. So they actually came up with a plan for education construction, which right now there's a moratorium on school construction. And I think this 454, when it passes, that will go away. I said, well, where are you going to get the money? Part of it was that if a district didn't spend all the money that they were allocated, it was going to get taken back and put into the school construction fund. So So they're thinking both ways, which is important. So that when this plan rolls out, that hopefully we'll be on the rise population wise, and we actually start to repair some of our schools that need the schoolhouses that need construction.
So I think our advice, and maybe Terry will disagree, but I don't think so. For those of you listening that have a very keen interest in the educational reform that Vermont is going through, make sure you pay attention to who is on that task force, where they're meeting, when they're meeting. It should be open meetings. There shouldn't be any sort of closed doors on this. So I'm not sure how much testimony they'll take necessarily from citizens, but you could certainly listen and learn about what they're going to be talking about. I mean, beside the maps and the districts, they haven't decided yet on classroom size, to my knowledge. I don't think that's in the bill. School choice is still very much up in the air. The independent schools versus the public schools also, that was addressed to some degree in the bill that was passed, but I don't think there's a period at the end of that sentence. I think there'll be more to see on that. So I would just urge people to stay informed by making themselves available either in person or on Zoom or some sort of platform that they come up with where citizens of Vermont and taxpayers can find out what the future might hold. There's so many things that have yet to be decided. I think it is important for people to keep their eye on the ball, so to speak. The other thing that happened earlier this week, I believe it was on Wednesday, was the so-called S-51 bill, which had to do with taxes and relief for some of our citizens, including military veterans, retirement pensions. They will be exempt. And again, this is a retroactive bill all the way back to January of this year. So when they file taxes this coming at the end of the year in December, or if you get the extension, or to April, I guess, you can include the $125,000 exemption of income, and then it scales back to between there and 175. It goes back and then over 175. At this point, there is no further relief, but I will be working to see if we can't get that pension exemption to be unlimited. In other words, a total exemption. And so that was one thing that was in that. There were Social Security adjustments for people that are on Social Security. You now have an extra $5,000. So it goes, I think, from 50 to 55 if you're a single filer. And if you're married filing jointly, it's now $65,000. Anything under that is tax exempt. It moves up to $70,000. So it was an additional $5,000. The child tax credit was moved from, if you have kids that are 5 years of age or under, that moves up to 6 years of age and under, and it's $1,000 per kid that you can take a deduction for. And there was also an earned income tax credit that was part of that bill. And interestingly, and we had a lot of discussion about this, Terry was on the bill that I sponsored, and Bill Canfield did a similar bill in the House of Representatives. They were exactly identical in terms of language. But neither bill, and we were just focused on the military, to be fair. Now, neither bill was taken off the wall. The chair of both the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee did not take it up. And it wasn't until we had another bill that originally had to do with elder care, basically, that was taken up. And then that provision was struck. And then all the other things I just mentioned, the military, the earned income tax, the child tax, and the Social Security were added back in. And then it went to a conference of a committee of conference, and then finally came out and it was passed. And it's funny because, and Terry's well aware of this, when I put the bill in on the Senate side, I had 21 of 30 senators who signed onto the bill, which normally would mean when it comes to the floor, you have 21 votes. If you didn't bother to sign on to it, you could still be convinced. But relatively rarely does it happen that someone will sponsor a bill and then vote no for it. So we had 21 out of 30. And in the House, it was an even split. It was 75 out of the 150. So it was pretty obvious, and this was a bipartisan, even a tripartisan effort, that if it ever got to the floor, it was going to pass. And I think in large measure that was why neither bill ever got to the floor, because the chairs didn't want it. But in the end, they did compromise. And so what came out of that was S-51, and it was signed into law by the governor in a ceremonial ceremony on Wednesday. And Senator Williams and I were both there. And Representative Pritchard joined us as well. So we went up and represented Rutland County at the signing. And so that was a very important bill. It does create about a $13 million hole that we're going to have to fill one way or another. I'm very strongly in the belief that in terms of the military, people that will be not moving out of Vermont because now they can stay and take advantage of that, and those that might have considered moving into Vermont before, but then were held up and hesitant because of the way the tax structure was, will now say, okay, well, they finally moved in the right direction. Let's move to Vermont. And these are retirees that are still young enough to do a lot of jobs for us and contribute to the economy. So I don't think that that's going to be necessarily a negative. And that was about trying to remember, Terry, $3-point-something million hole. A lot of the other the remaining $10 million out of that $13 million was created from the Social Security exemption and the child tax and the earned income tax. So there will be still a hole, but it was just the right thing to do, and it took so darn long. I've been doing that for 11 years, trying to do it. The governor, when he came in, he was the lieutenant governor, so he didn't have any bills necessarily in place, but as soon as he was elected governor, so for 9 years, Governor Scott has also been trying to get it done, and we finally did. It was an incremental step, but I think a substantial one in the right direction.
I think it was as a veteran, it was a great day for veterans that, I know a lot of people that served with me, retired and moved out of state, that after a while they miss Vermont. They miss the Four Seasons, depending on where they move. I think a lot of them probably would consider moving back here to take advantage of that. Problem we got is that, where are they going to stay? We don't have any housing. We got housing problems. So, and when these retirees, typically a 20-year retirement, they're 40 years old, they have skills that we need in Vermont. And they can come back, they bring their spouses with them, who are normally professionally, technically proficient people, and they bring their kids back with them in a lot of cases. So I am anxiously waiting to see the results of this. I think the governor mentioned that in his when he signed the bill.
He did.
Yep. So I'm veterans benefit from this. Low income people that have kids benefit from it. But we're all going to have to pay for it, and hopefully revenues will come into the state that we can offset that $13 million. So,
yeah, we're talking with Senator Terry Williams from Poultney, who has represented 27 towns in Rutland County. He, along with Senator Weeks, who was unavailable today to join us, serve on the Education Committee. Terry's also the vice chair of the Senate Natural Resources Committee. And so we can talk about some of the bills that came in there, and some were not taken up, and some that maybe were problematic in one way or another. We're going to take our first break, though, on the show. And there's lots more to talk about. We did talk about a little bit about the election bill. If people have an interest in that, we can certainly go over that. I have a list of all the bills that were signed into law by the governor, and that'll be an interesting list to go over if we get that far. And again, we're just sort of going over what happened in the legislative session just concluded, but this is literally a 40,000-foot view of things. We're not going to get too deep, and we're certainly not going to cover every topic. But we will take our first break here on Catamount Community Connection, and we'll be back with Senator Williams in just a moment. Catamount Radio. Today we're talking with Senator Terry Williams from Poultney, who sits on both the Education Committee in the Senate and also the Natural Resources Committee in the Senate. Our show brought to you by the Rutland County Agricultural Society, which has brought you the Vermont State Fair at Rutland since 1846. And yes, folks, the 178th Fair is coming up August 12th through the 16th at the Vermont State Fairgrounds here in Rutland. So one of the things that we had, I don't want to say campaigned on, although I think Terry and I did, but there were, there's always differing views in politics, was this clean heat standard situation, which was put into place back probably 2 or 3 years ago now. And the complexion of the legislature was much different then. And one of the so-called blue dogs, Jane Kitchell, who was from Caledonia County and also longtime chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, put in a checkback provision in that original bill that basically said that the clean heat standard could not go into effect until the legislature checked back and voted it in. And so we had some efforts to bring that to the floor a couple of times, mainly because of Senator Williams, and it never made it to the floor for a vote because we were fairly sure that we could be a no on that, and it just never happened. But eventually, and I'll let Terry sort of get into the details on this, the Public Utility Commission, which was in charge of that whole project, the PUC, came back and said, we can't go any further with this right now until the legislature does something, and if they don't, we're pretty much done with it. Doesn't mean it goes away totally. It's sort of still, it's like a phone call on hold. It's still out there, but nothing further will be done with it. And I think for a lot of people that's good news. But again, there are people that strongly feel that the clean heat standard was the best way to address some of the climate change issues that are evident and going forward. So I know you tried a couple times to get it to the floor, and it just didn't happen.
Right. So let me back up a little bit to the, 2 biennium ago.
Yep.
I think started in 2020. There are disadvantages to being the minority, the super minority, and the Senate was no exception. We had, I think, when I first got in, 7 senators out of 30. So the Global Warming Solution Act started all this. And basically, we didn't have any representation in the Senate Natural Resources and Education and Natural Resources Committee, except I think Senator Corey Parent from Franklin County was in there. So we didn't know what was going on in that committee. And it was the same thing in the last biennium. They came out with the Affordable Heat Act. And basically, finally I stepped up and I said, if I get reelected, said this to Senator Randy Brock, I want to be on the Senate Natural Resources Committee. He says, nobody wants to be on that committee. I said, well, I do. So the good news is that we finally had somebody in there that was paying attention to what was going on. And I remembered that at the end of the previous biennium that ended in 2023, the check back for the Affordable Heat Act. Unfortunately, we had to have a bill to get presented on the floor because of the biennium change that would bring that bill, that check back vote, had to have successfully pass the House and the Senate. And for some reason, I don't know if they thought they didn't have enough votes, but they kept that bill on the wall. Nobody even mentioned it. So I introduced Bill S-68. S-68 was a repeal of the Affordable Heat Act. And I got it on, I actually briefed it to my committee, but it didn't go anywhere, just that. So I asked the chairman of the committee 3 different times, are you going to bring my bill up? And she said, which bill? I said, my bill S-68. And she said, no. So she presented another bill, which was S-65. Notice that the number is previous to 68, that she had been working on with Legislative Council, which basically protected the Efficiency Vermont and the Affordable Heat Act. She brought that to the floor. So when I asked her the 3rd time if she was going to bring my S-68 bill to the floor for a vote, she said no. We got our heads together, and we came up with the nuclear option, which is a rule that if a bill is not moving and a majority of our caucus wanted it to come off the wall, we could petition the Senate to relieve that committee of that bill, bring it to the floor for a vote, which we did. Didn't make a lot of people on the other side of the aisle happy, but we brought it out and did get a roll call vote. And it was right down party lines. It was 17-13. So anyway, it was out there. And when in January, the Public Utility Commission was responsible to bring back the report, basically what they said was, we don't understand this plan. We don't understand how the recs are going to work, how anybody's going to make this thing work, so we basically don't support it. And the bill basically was dead at that point, except it's still on the wall, and it still is today. So it can come back at any time. I think that people realized that we didn't know if it was going to be a 70 cent per gallon increase for heating oil, or if it was going to be $4. There were a lot of different estimates out there, and nobody could come to a conclusion on what it was going to cost Vermonters. And we didn't want to leave. The Public Utility Commission said that the ones that are going to be affected most negatively by this are low-income Vermonters that are living in mobile homes, that they have to have propane or fuel oil. They can't afford a heat pump for heat, and they can't. Their entrance to their house has to be 200 amps to bring heat pumps in, and most of them couldn't afford to have a couple $1,000s for putting a new entrance in. So the bill is basically dead, which is good news. Then we had another bill, H110 or S110. It was my bill, which was going to repeal the Global Warming Solution Act. It was basically going to take the private right of action out. It was going to reorganize the Climate Council, which was going to put more of A&R involved in that, rather than it was basically, I think it was 12 people on that council, and none of them were elected officials. And that didn't go anywhere either, so that's still on the wall. But hopefully we can work something out where both those bills can come out in the next session, and then we can get them voted and get them put to bed so they go away.
Again, for the benefit of those of you listening that may not know this, a biennium is a 2-year period of time during which the General Assembly, which includes both the House and the Senate, meet. And if you introduce a bill in the first year of the biennium and it's not taken up, it remains on the walls, and that's our phrase for saying that the chair and the committee did not choose to take testimony on the bill, but they left it up on the wall, it is still a viable bill the next year. So you have 2 years in which you can move a bill in terms of it being taken down off the wall, taking testimony, moving it out of committee, moving it to the floor, and then moving it across to the other chamber. So if it's a Senate bill and it gets through the committee process and the floor, then it goes to the House. They do the same thing. It's referred to a committee. They vote in the committee. They vote on the floor. And so once it's passed both, then the governor can weigh in. And the governor has 3 choices. He or she can sign the bill into law, can allow it to become law without his or her signature, or can veto it. Those are the 3 options. But the important thing to remember is, as Terry mentioned, Senator Williams mentioned, a bill's still active and can be acted on in that 2-year period. Once that second year of the biennium ends, all bills are dead. And in order for anything to be brought up again, you have to reintroduce a bill in the next legislative session, the next biennium, and the whole process continues. The other thing that some people don't realize, if a bill is passed, you can come back the next year and amend it. That's okay. But if a bill is voted on and defeated, you cannot bring that topic up again for the rest of that biennium. So if it's done in the first year, The second year, you can't bring that bill back up again. You have to wait until that biennium has ended and then do something else. And then you get into a question of germaneness. If you rewrite the bill and change it enough so it's not a mirror of what was defeated, you could probably get it through. Anyway, those are kind of those parliamentary things that every now and then they come up, and they're important, and it is important to know the rules when you're trying to move something. The other thing that came out of the Natural Resources Committee in both chambers was the 3-acre rule, and we did manage, and it was a provision in another bill. It wasn't a standalone bill, but we did manage to get some relief for those that have already appeared on this list of 700 or 800 properties that fall under this 3-acre rule requirement. And so we pushed the effective date of the implementation of that out 3 years. So in 2028, it will now have to be done unless we do something else in the interim. And I think that was an important move in the right direction as well. Certainly when we had Robert Congdon on the last couple of weeks here, we did talk about the Vermont State Fair facing literally an existential threat with that 3-acre rule. It was going to cost upwards of $3 million to come into compliance. They don't have $3 million. And so they would have just gone out of business if they didn't get some relief. So we did put a little bit of a breathing room piece in, and they're going to have to come up with a way to do something else in the meantime. There was a bill in the Agriculture Committee that also exempts the Vermont State Fair from any impact fees and any off-site mitigation efforts. So whatever they do, they're going to have to be able to do it inside the fairgrounds, and it's going to have to be carefully looked at. In other words, you can't just put a pond in the middle of the fairgrounds and say, okay, we've done our job, because that affects a lot of other things that are going on. But that other 3-acre rule deadline extension was very important too, I think.
Yeah. That was H-482. It was actually a House bill that it wasn't going to get taken up in my committee in the Senate, but the House Natural Committee was able to convince the chair, it's Amy Sheldon, that it was an important issue because it affected people, basically anybody in the Lake Champlain or the Lake Memphremagog drainage, and it was going to cost people money, so they wanted to bring it up. So then we ended up with the bill. It ended up 482. We got a lot of testimony from the Agency of Natural Resources. Julie Moore, the secretary, came in, and basically the deputy commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation, Neil Kamen, came down to the Rutland Fairgrounds and looked at the situation down there. The other thing they did was they found some money from ARPA funds that the state had retained from municipalities that hadn't spent that money, and they were able to offset the fees for the permitting and the planning for the 3-acre impervious surface rule. Unfortunately, the fair, the Rutland Fair, as you said, they ended up with $3.5 million was going to cost them plan, but most of the things, the conditions that were affecting their ability to do anything were beyond their control. In other words, there was a culvert underneath the Vermont Railway's track that didn't meet FEMA standards, and every time we got significant rain, that flooded in that area. The other thing was the City of Rutland's flow restoration plan, which had never been actioned, that was causing them problems upstream. So basically what they did was they found enough money from the EPA Clean Water Fund to offset the permitting fees for the fair, and were able to push it back 3 years. And they still have to do the plan, which they have. Even though they don't have the money, somehow they're going to do what they can do when they can do it. And at the end of the 3-year period, they'll have to go back to ANR and say, hey, this is what we've done. we've shown interest, and we've shown that we really know there's a problem. We want to fix it. We need more help. So hopefully they'll get it.
We're talking to State Senator Terry Williams, who lives in Poultney but represents all of Rutland County, so 27 towns. The other thing that I would quickly want to mention, because we have to take our second break, the city of Rutland also got approved with some amendments to their charter. We did talk about that on this show probably, well, let's see, the bill was signed June 5th, so shortly after that we talked a lot about what those provisions were. There were 4 of them, I think, and none of them were particularly controversial. In many ways, they were sort of technical changes. They just caught up to what was pretty much already in effect. So I wanted to mention that, and that was one of the bills. The bills here, I'm looking at them, there's probably 80 or 90 bills that were signed into law this year. And then the other thing I would mention in terms of the property taxes with respect to the education reform that's underway, we got a breakdown, if you will, from the Joint Fiscal and the Tax Department that shows that in Rutland County, of the 27 towns, 24 of the 27 will have lower property taxes if that bill goes into effect by fiscal year 29, which is July 1st, 28. 3 towns will see increases. I'm not exactly sure why, but they're West Rutland, Ira, and West Haven. Those were the 3 that showed plus signs. Ira was probably about 12% up, as I recall. I could have that number wrong. And I'm not sure why, because they don't even have a school. It may have something to do with property tax reappraisal or property reappraisal. I don't know when they last had appraised value checked. And then the other 2, I don't know. They're very small towns, obviously, Ira and West Haven. But those were the only 3 that looked as though they were in a worse situation unless something else happens in the interim than they are now. All 24 of the other towns will see lower property taxes if everything comes to pass the way the bill is outlined to do. And we'll have to wait and see, because obviously that bill still has a long way to go. All right, let's take our second break here on Catamount Community Connection. We'll be back with Senator Williams in just a moment. Welcome back to Catamount Community Connection. I'm your host, Brian Collamore, and today we are talking with Senator Terry Williams of Rutland County. Our show brought to you by the Rutland County Agricultural Society. Don't forget, the fair's coming up, folks. August 12th through the 16th at the Vermont State Fairgrounds here in Rutland. Great acts coming, and we're looking forward to the 178th Vermont State Fair. So we've talked a lot about the education situation, if you will. There was another bill, and I know Senator Williams wants to talk a little bit about that, and this was 480, I think you said?
H480,
yeah. Okay.
So H480 was a miscellaneous education bill. Again, it came from the House. Passed out of the House in March. It was amended as it moved through the Senate Education Committee and the Senate floor vote. The Senate passed it on March 27th, 2028, and the House committed concurrent with the Senate proposal of amendment. So I'm just going to go down through some of the sections, because a miscellaneous ed bill is kind of a hodgepodge, catch-all. You know, we got components of other bills that didn't make it, but they're important to people, and we really think we need to have the thing get passed out. So H480 still does not have an act number. I don't think it's been signed by the governor, but I believe he's going to pass it. Basically, I'm going to go section by section. Section 1 is the intent of the bill. Section 2, behavioral threat assessment team's procedure. So every school now has to have a behavior threat assessment team, and the Agency of Education, in concurrence with the Department of Public Safety, and most municipalities have people involved in that also. The procedure is finalized in this bill. Section 3 addresses post-secondary schools. I won't get into that, but that's your, Vermont State Education Program for Vermont State University and UVM. Section 4 amends 16 VSA nutrition contracts and public bids, striking language that sets a bill threshold at $25,000 for purchases of non-food items by a nonprofit school food service court. So that was a continuation, basically, to make sure that the school nutrition program kept going. Section 5 was virtual learning, which talks about IEPs and 504 plans and how students can that can't get into school or the school doesn't provide that service, they can get online and learn it virtually from another district. Section 6 amends 16 VSA by redefining, I just said that. Section 7 is BOCES, which is a system that actually passed last biennium that said that school districts, if they agreed to do it, could cooperate and merge for support services. In other words, you got a school district that has additional special ed teachers or threat behavioral specialists that could come down and they could contract with some other agency that provides that. It passed into law, but no school district actually took advantage of that. So that's just keeping that component alive. Section 8, military-related post-secondary opportunities, requiring school districts to utilize resources to include information regarding the admission process and requirements necessary to proceed with any and all military-related opportunities with flexibility pathways planning. So that's good. It opens up the schools so that recruiters can get in there. They can talk to students about other opportunities once they graduate, about joining the Guard or Reserve or the active component. It used to be that they only had one day that they were allowed into a school in the school year. So. Section 10, supplemental reading instruction, which was basically changed to title Foundation for Libraries for Literacy, which started out as a bill S-15. Martine Gulick introduced that said that they were establishing literary standards that every student had to meet because different schools taught different methods. So that passed out. Section 11 addresses tuition benefits for Vermont National Guardsmen. It basically, it was already a law. I think they had $1.1 million that they were allowed for through VSAC, if you're a Vermont National Guard member, to actually take up additional post-secondary education that they may need for advancement through the Guard. And it's a win-win. We work well with VSAC. It's also extended to members of the Vermont Guard that don't live in Vermont. And as long as they can actually get a grant for that doesn't exceed resident tuition for UVM. So that's good for the Guard. Section 13, cardiac emergency response plan. Every school has to have one. There's no funding requirement for it, but every school needs to have a cardiac, an AED available for sporting events, and they have to have one in the school, and people have to be trained to use it for staff. It started out with just the school nurse, but now it's gone into athletic trainers, and they actually have teams in a lot of schools, so that'll standardize that practice. Section 14 It removes the requirement in 16 VSA for voter approval of a final energy performance contract and terms that include payment to a contractor over a period of time exceeding 10 years. And what they did was they extended it to 20 years. So that, and I think what they had was they were having trouble finding 3 contractors that would bid on a job because we don't have a lot of contractors in Vermont. So now they're going to, I think they'll accept one contract. So, and there was a dollar amount on that could not be exceeded. Section 14 provides for the exception of moratorium, new approved independent schools for therapeutic approved independent schools that either change their tax status from to convert to a nonprofit organization. So we do have a very few therapeutic schools. Those are schools that the student has a special need that special education won't provide for, and part of the problem was if they were a nonprofit and they wanted to go for a for-profit, the process was so complex and so drawn out that a lot of people were it deterred their ability to do that. So that got taken care of.
Okay.
Section 17 and 18, cell phones, personal electronic
I was going to ask you about cell phones. So tell us about the cell phone.
Okay. In social media, basically what that does is it requires the Agency of Education to come up with a plan to eliminate the use of personal electronic devices and cell phones in Vermont schools bell to bell. So from the first bell to the last bell. And so a lot of schools had already done that. We introduced this bill back in January of 23, and it didn't go anywhere because initially I think it was such a new concept that the V's, the NEA, Vermont NEA, the Student Principals Association, Superintendent, they all voted, they didn't support it. Well, then there was a grassroots swell of support for this and worldwide, nationwide. And I think that we actually had 12 states that adopted Vermont's language verbatim.
So this is something that's already passed.
It has.
And when you say bell to bell, say I am a freshman in high school.
Yep.
When I come to school with my cell phone, I have to put it somewhere and turn it off, or how does that work? And when you say bell to bell, what about at lunch? Can I go get it at lunch and be able to catch up on messages or?
No.
No.
So
okay.
This is going to be the Agency of Education has to come up with a policy.
Okay.
They're not going to, because there was no money attached to it, they don't have to go buy a yonder pouch system where every student has a place to put it. They can either require them to keep it in their lockers, keep it in a plastic container in the homeroom, but basically they'll have to shut it off. They won't have access to it unless they have a special need for a medical condition where they have to use it to check blood sugar levels or something like that. So, and again, they have until January to come up with that plan, the Agency of Education.
Can a student keep the phone on their person but just shut it off?
No.
No.
They have to physically.
Wow.
And because what's going to happen? You and I were kids at one point and said we'd figure some way to get around that.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
We'll bring in a phone that doesn't work, and we'll keep our, the one that does work in our backpack.
Yeah.
So, and what we didn't want it to cause was a enforcement problem, because the teachers really, I heard the teachers weren't going to support it, but in the end they did, because they had to be the phone police. They always had to go find, get little Johnny and take his phone away from him, and if he violated the rules the second time, you had to go to the principal's office. This is going to take them away. You can have it, you can bring it to school, but you're not going to have access to it.
And this will be a policy that all public schools and independent schools in Vermont have to comply to?
All approved independent schools,
Okay.
Yes.
Well, that will be an interesting policy decision coming up from Zoe Saunders, our education secretary. And we're down to about a minute left here. there anything else, Terry, Senator Williams, that you have in your head about a natural resources bill that you still want to work in? Or I think we talked about the Education Committee enough.
I think the hot button issue that's still burning with me is the 3-acre impervious surface rule.
Okay.
That's been around since 2015.
Yep.
And nobody did anything about it. And now all of a sudden, because they got caught not doing anything about the state, that people are going to have, and as the 717 people list the areas that were on the original list, once they got out and started looking at their situation, they found out there are a lot of other areas. So that's going to be a continuing issue that everybody's going to have to deal with, and it can be very expensive for municipalities, because now, with H 4782 being passed, that makes all municipalities stormwater districts. So they have to come up with a plan to deal with everything within the boundary of their municipality.
Okay.
So
we didn't get into the Senate Agriculture Committee's work. One thing I do want to mention very quickly, because we are running out of time, we do have a new right to farm law that I believe the governor's already signed. This will increase the protection from nuisance suits to our farmers. Somebody can't move in next to a farm and say, oh gosh, it smells. The manure, I don't like that manure smell. You got to do something about it. If they were there before you, you can't sue them, in essence. So, I'm putting that in pretty plain terms, but it's that sort of situation that comes up every now and then.
that was S45.
Okay, and that did pass. The education, we talked about government operations. We didn't get to the elections bill. As far as I know, there won't be another elections bill next year. Generally speaking, we do that every other year, so we'll have to wait and see. And with that, I just want to thank Senator Williams for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show as we try to at least give the highlights of the legislative session. And we'll have you back on soon.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to Catamount Radio for hosting this.
Sure. All right. And we will see all of you next week here on Catamount Community Connection.